Hello, and welcome to another lesson in our series on the book of Exodus. The title of the series is The Story of a People, and the title of today's lesson is God Provides for His People. We'll be looking specifically at scripture from the first part of Exodus chapter 16. In prior lessons, we have looked at the books from the beginning, talking with the birth of Moses. And when we started the book, we started with the premise God has a plan. Now let's put this in perspective. Some 600 years before, God promised Abraham that his descendants, Abraham's descendants, would one day own that land that Abraham only lived in as a stranger. He promised him that his descendants, although they would go into bondage for 400 years, live in another country for 400 years, that at the right time he would bring a deliverer and deliver Abraham's descendants from bondage and give to them, establish them as the owners of this land that he was simply visiting at the time. We saw that throughout the book of Exodus, this plan of God has been developing. Okay, God has a plan for his people. His people are in bondage. They cry out. God hears their cry. And we had the story of the birth of Moses. Miraculous story. As a Hebrew child, should have been executed according to the orders of the Pharaoh, that is, thrown into the river and drowned. But his mother, as we know the story, hid him in the bushes, in the bulrushes of the river. The Pharaoh's daughter finds him, and then she agrees that Moses' mother, Jochebed, can raise him. So for the first 3 or 4 years of his life, he is raised as a Hebrew. He is taught the way of the Israelites. Then his mother surrenders him to the daughter of the Pharaoh, and she raises him as a son through the teenage years, the childhood years and the teenage years, as heir apparent to the Pharaoh, as a grandson, there in the Pharaoh's palace, receiving the best education possible. Now, he's got a Hebrew education for the first 3 or 4 years. He's got the best secular education that was known in that day for the next several years. And, according to Stephen in his account, at the age of 40, Moses leaves Egypt and goes to Midian. And we looked at the circumstances of that. God has a plan. The plan's all working out. He killed the Egyptian. He realizes the Hebrews have turned against him, and so he flees to Midian, and he lives in Midian for, according to Stephen, another 40 years. While he is there, he is working as a shepherd, caring for his father-in-law's sheep there on the Sinai Peninsula in the land of Midian. Learning how to survive out in the wilderness. God has a plan. More education and training for the ultimate call, fulfillment of the call on Moses' life. Then we looked at the lesson where God called Moses from the burning bush and told him he was to go and to tell the Pharaoh to let the people go. Moses resisted, and God made the promise to him, I will be with you. And then, of course, he answered the other questions by providing Moses' brother Aaron as a spokesperson. And Aaron and Moses then go to the people of Israel, and the people of Israel accept them. And then they go to Pharaoh, and they ask Pharaoh to allow the Israelites to go out into the wilderness for 3 days to hold a festival to worship their God. And Pharaoh responds, I don't know who that God is. Who is that? No, you're not going. You're lazy. And so he ordered them to go back to tell the people to go back to work. He then changed the conditions of their working, wherein before they were supplied straw and required to make brick. Now he took away the supply of straw and made the Israelites find their own straw and still produce the same number of brick. And of course that meant the work was harder, and when they didn't fulfill their quotas, they were oppressed severely. We didn't look at it in our lessons, but we know the story of the 10 plagues. When God, through 10 successive miraculous events, got Pharaoh's attention, But Pharaoh always refused, or he would agree and then change his mind, refused to let the people go. And of course, the 10th of those plagues was the killing of the firstborn of every household of the Egyptians, but not of the Hebrews, who had taken the blood off of the sacrifice of the Passover lamb and put it on their door, and the death angel passed over them. And so now Pharaoh not only agrees for them to go, he orders for them to leave. God has a plan. He's working this plan out. One of the promises that God made to Abraham back over there in Genesis was that when his descendants left bondage, they would go out a wealthy people. And sure enough, we're told there in Exodus that when the people of Israel left Egypt, the Egyptian neighbors, gave them of their belongings to take with them, and they left a wealthy people. And so we have the children of Israel now having left, and then we looked at the lesson where God told them to backtrack and go back to the way they came, causing the Pharaoh to think that they were lost. And so the Pharaoh changes his mind now and chases them. And we saw that lesson where God fought for his people. That is, he got them in a position where they were trapped by the sea on one side and Pharaoh's army on the other. And then he took the cloud and moved it around behind the people to keep the Egyptians in darkness. And the pillar of fire was on the side with the Hebrews. And then during the night, the wind blew, the waters parted, and they crossed the Red Sea on dry ground. Once they got across, the Egyptian soldiers followed them into the Red Sea. And when they got into the Red Sea, God brought confusion on them, caused the waters to come back, and the entire Egyptian army is destroyed. God has a plan. Moses had told the people of Israel, just be still, hold on. God has a plan. God's going to take care of you. In fact, he told them, the Egyptian army you see today, you will not see again. And sure enough, the entire Egyptian army is killed in that when the waters come back and when the Red Sea is once again water covering the area, and the soldiers all drown. Okay. They've seen miracle after miracle after miracle. The plagues, the drying of the Red Sea, the killing of the Egyptian army. Miracle after miracle after miracle. But when they got out of Egypt and had crossed the Red Sea, the people grumbled. Well, verse 1, go back. When they got to the Red Sea and it looked like they were pinned in, they grumbled. Exodus 14, 11 through 12. They said, Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. And then they saw a miracle, the drying of the Red Sea, the destruction of the Egyptian army. So now, after that miracle, as they're making their way east, they begin to grumble again. They traveled 3 days. They couldn't find any water. And then when they did find some water, it was bitter, and they could not drink it. Exodus 15:24. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, what are we to drink? But through Moses, God miraculously provided them with water. Okay? Now, again, they saw all those miracles. They come into a crisis, and they grumble, complain. No faith that God can take care of them. God provides another supernatural event, drying of the Red Sea. They get to the other side, and within 3 days, because they didn't see where the water was, they gave up and began to grumble again. Miracle after miracle. But then when difficulty comes, instead of trusting Yahweh, all they can talk about is, why in the world did you bring us out here? They put their focus on what it used to be in Egypt. and they had a very distorted memory as to what was going on in Egypt. Now, for today's lesson, the setting for today's lesson, they've been out of Egypt about a month. They're on their way to the promised land. Now, these folks understood that the promise that was made to Abraham has been passed down from generation to generation. And the reason I say that, suggest that to you, is remember when they left, they took with them the bones of Joseph. And why did they take with them the bones of Joseph? Joseph's been dead for 400 years. Because at the time of Joseph, they had the promise that one day they would be delivered and they would live in that promised land. And Joseph said, when you go, take me with you. And that had been passed down through the 4 centuries. And now that they're leaving, they take Joseph's bones with them. So I suggest to you, their understanding of a promised deliverance and the fact they were to live in that promised land, that was something that they knew of and knew about. Yet every time a crisis came up, they turned their minds elsewhere. They turned their focus elsewhere. They come out of Egypt. They've been out of Egypt about a month. And they come to a place that's called Elim. And we're told that at Elim, there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees. And some translate the word palm to mean large trees. This was a beautiful place to camp. This was an oasis. Obviously, there's going to be water there. This was a beautiful place to camp. And then they begin to make their way further east, headed for the promised land. That was God's promise. That was God's plan. And we pick up in chapter 16, verse 1. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. And on the 15th day of the 2nd month, after they had come out of Egypt, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather for the other days. A new complaint. They've been out of Elim 3 days. Seems like the water's running out. The food's running out. The supplies they brought with them is running out. They are halfway between Elim and probably what we know of as Mount Sinai. The area, and Mount Sinai is where God will appear to them and give them the law, a future lesson. Okay. This area in between is called sometimes the Desert of Sin. Now, the word sin is not meant to be used here in the way that we normally think of the word sin. It's not talking about misconduct. It's not talking about violating God's law. In fact, some people spell the word sin with a Z and say it's Zen. Some think it's a short for Sinai, which is not too far away, so joining Mount Sinai. But the whole community now, they've come out, they're 3 days out there, they're in the middle of a desert, there's not any food to be had on the ground, there's not any food growing there for them to pick. Probably their supplies they brought with them out of Egypt have begun to dwindle now, or maybe be gone, and they are anticipating the worst. They're anticipating they're going to starve. And so they begin to grumble. And so they grumble against Moses and Aaron. Interesting. Back over in Exodus chapter 9, when discussing the plagues, remember one of the plagues was that God would destroy all of the cattle and sheep of the Egyptians. But specifically, chapter 9 says, he did not destroy the cattle and the sheep of the Hebrews, of the Israelites. Impliedly, they had cattle and sheep traveling with them as they're making their way out, and they're bringing their belongings headed for the promised land. It's only been 3 days. We have nothing to indicate that they have already eaten all of the cattle and sheep that they brought with them. What am I saying? There was, push comes to shove, a supply of food, but it wasn't right there readily available, and so they begin to grumble. They begin to grumble. One commentator wrote this. He said, it would seem that starvation was more anticipated than experienced. In other words, they did not live through weeks and weeks of famine, nor did they see their family and friends die of malnutrition, or even have to kill their livestock for food. Instead, they started to feel hungry, and they anticipated starvation. Okay? See how easy, after miracle after miracle after miracle, after seeing God part the Red Sea and providing them deliverance over dry land, and then destroying the Egyptian army, after he's provided for them water, and now, because they're hungry, they anticipate starvation. On the 15th day of the second month, we're told this occurs. Now, that can be read two different ways, and commentators differ as to which way they choose. It can be read that in the 15th day of the second month of the year. Now, if you read earlier in Exodus, when God has given them instructions about preparing that first Passover meal, he says, this shall be the first month of your year. And on 10th day, you select the lamb, and then on the 14th day, and Passover was always the 14th day of the first month. So if this is to be read the 15th day of the second month of the year, then that means we've only been gone from Egypt for about a month. Now, if it's to be read the 15th day of the second month after they left Egypt, then they've been traveling 6 weeks or so. And as I said, you can read it either way, and commentaries differ as to which of those two ways they choose. But however it is, they haven't been out of Egypt very long. They've seen miracles. And now, because there doesn't seem to be any food readily apparent, anticipating starvation, they begin to mumble. They begin to grumble. They have very selective memories. They said, oh, what did you bring us out here for? You should have let us stayed in Egypt. Even if the Lord had killed us in Egypt, it would have been better to die in Egypt. Because in Egypt, we sat around, we had all around pots of meat, and we had all we wanted to eat. That was what they remembered about Egypt. They didn't remember the beatings, the hard work, the slavery, the oppression, that which caused them to cry out to God for help. They didn't remember that. They just remembered that they sat around and had all they wanted to eat. They accused Aaron and Moses of improper motives. They said, you brought us out here to die. What are you doing? Bringing us out? You brought us out here to die. And then God responded. God responded in verse 4. And he says, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. He's heard their murmuring. He's heard their cries for help. He's heard their expressions of concern for the anticipated starvation. And so he says, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. Now, this is Yahweh, Lord, Yahweh, speaking to Moses. And he says, but I'm doing this for a purpose. I want to test the people. Yeah, I want to meet their need, but I'm going to test the people. He said, here are the instructions. Tell them to go out each day and to gather as much as they need for themselves for that day. Now, that's this positive statement. Impliedly, he's saying, but don't gather more than what you need. And of course, we'll find out later there was a reason for that. But he says, gather what you need for that one day. And he says, let's see if they follow direct instructions. Let's see if in fact they will listen. They've got to make a choice. They got to make a choice to do it my way or do it their way. Boy, this sounds awful familiar, doesn't it? You can eat of any tree of the garden except this one tree. They had a choice to make. and they made the wrong choice. These people had a choice. They could go out and gather what they needed, or they could go out and gather more than they needed. He said, I'm going to test them. This is the test, to see if they'll trust him. Now, how would this be a test of trust? Well, if there's ample food and you only gather enough for one day, what you are saying is, I trust God that he will provide me enough food the next day. Trusting God. Were they willing to follow his instructions? Gather as much as you need for today. Why? Because that's what I told you to do. Were they willing just to trust him because he said to do it? Were they willing to put aside their fear that there might not be food tomorrow and simply follow his instructions? Will they trust him? Now notice, this instruction involved an effort on their part. They had to make a choice, but then they had to go out and physically gather. I mean, God could have provided them enough food by just raining it down right there and putting it in their mouth. He provided, but he also expected them to go out and gather it. And then he told them there were limitations on what they should gather. And then he said, on the sixth day, gather twice as much as you need. Okay, impliedly, on the seventh day, there's not going to be any. Gather twice as much so you'll have food prepared for the seventh day. It's a choice. It was, now when they were slaves, they didn't have many choices to make. But now they're free. And they need to make a choice. Will they trust God? Will they follow his instructions? Or are they going to try to do it on their own? So he gave them an opportunity. He's going to give them an opportunity for deliverance, for food. God has a plan. He's going to take care of his people. But they need to learn to trust him. Okay, let's read verse 6. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, in the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. Lord, there is Yahweh, that same promise-making, promise-keeping God that spoke to Abraham and made the promise to him. The same promise-making, promise-keeping God that spoke to Moses in the burning bush and made promises to him that he has kept already. That same promise-making, promise-keeping God. He said, in the morning you will see the glory of this God, of Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Okay? In the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. In the morning you will see the glory of this Lord, because you've heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us? Moses also said, you will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. Twice there, he makes that point. He wants them to understand. When they grumbled against Moses and Aaron, they weren't really mumbling against Moses and Aaron. Moses and Aaron bore but God's instruments. He's saying, we haven't delivered you. We didn't dry up the Red Sea. We didn't kill the Egyptian army. We didn't provide the sweet water. It's not us that did it. It was God. And when you now complain that he hasn't performed the next miracle, you're grumbling against him. You're grumbling against him. And he says, he starts off by saying, people, recognize that you are going to have proof positive that it was Yahweh who brought you out of Egypt. And what that proof's going to be? You're going to have all you want to eat of meat tonight. He's heard your grumbling. He's heard your grumbling against him. And he's going to provide you meat tonight. And when he performs that supernatural miracle to provide you meat, you will know that it is this promise-making, promise-keeping God that has brought you out of Egypt. And then he says, and in the morning, you're going to see the glory of this promise-making, promise-keeping God. For you're going to have all the bread you want to eat. Again, a miracle that will vindicate, that will attest to the glory of God, this God who has brought you out of Egypt. So don't grumble against us. We don't have. It's not us that you're grumbling against. It's God. Um, Moses then tells the Israelites to come before God. Let's drop down there. Let's go back to verse 9 and read that again. Then Moses told Aaron, say to the entire Israelite community, come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of God appearing in a cloud. Okay? Moses is going to communicate with the people, but he does so through Aaron. So they go, and Aaron calls all the people together. He tells them to come and stand before the Lord, before Yahweh. And as he is calling them together and talking to them, they look, and there they see the cloud, the glory of the Lord. Now remember, the cloud has traveled ahead of them all the way along as they've made their journey. There was a cloud of smoke, if you will, ahead of them, and a pillar of fire. Now, the fire was there at night, the cloud was there in the daytime. This was the physical manifestation of God's presence with his people. And while Aaron has called them together and is going to give them instructions, the cloud appears. The glory of God's presence appears. God manifests himself in their presence, so they will know, I'm the God that has brought you thus far, and impliedly, the God that's going to take you on. Then, while they're standing there, seeing the cloud, the presence of God, the Lord said to Moses, he's speaking from the cloud, I have heard the grumblings of the Israelites. Tell them at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am God. Now, God speaks from the cloud to Moses. We do not know. It does not say whether the people of Israel, the Hebrews, whether they heard the voice as well. It seems that they didn't, because God said, tell them this, and he gives them a message. So if they had already heard the message, it wouldn't have to be repeated. So God speaks from the cloud to Moses and gives him instructions. He tells them, this is what you need to do. I've heard their grumbling. This is what should happen. And he says, tell them that at evening they're going to have meat. And they will know that their God is with them. Tell them at twilight you will eat meat. In the morning you'll be filled with bread. Okay? God's going to supply your needs. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. Then you will recognize that I am the God who keeps promises. I am Yahweh, the promise-making, promise-keeping God. Not just any God, the promise-making, promise-keeping God. I've made a promise. I've kept my promise. You're grumbling because you don't have food. Now you're going to have food. You will know that this is Yahweh who is with you. Okay, let's look to verse 13 to see the fulfillment. That evening, quail came and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a new layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Each one is to gather as much as he needs. Take an omer for each person that you have in your tent. The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they measured it by the omer, he who gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little did not have too little. Each one gathered as much as he needed. The fulfillment of what Moses has told them. You will know that God is with you because you're going to have food, you're going to have meat, and bread to eat. Okay? And then the fulfillment there in verse 13. That evening, the quail came and covered the camp. Um, there's no implication, there's no recitation of how they responded to seeing the quail and having the quail there to eat. The implied conclusion is, what we can read into it is, they evidently ate their fill. A commentator writes this: the quails mentioned here migrate regularly between South Europe and Arabia across the Sinai Peninsula. They are small, bullet-headed birds with a strong but low flight, usually roosting on the ground or in low bushes at nightfall. When exhausted, they would be unable to take off again. The birds are good eating and were a favorite delicacy of the Egyptians. And so that night, this flock of quail, this was not necessarily unusual. This was not something that never happened before. But these quail landed right there where they were. And they were so tired, they weren't able to take off. And the people were able to go out and pick up and eat as much meat as they wanted. They could eat as much as they want. Then the next morning they got up and there was dew on the ground. And when the dew melted, it left a thin layer gathered throughout the land. It said when the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. They'd never seen anything like this. Now, the quail they may have seen before. They'd never seen anything like this. This is supernatural. This is something that's beyond explaining. And they ask, what is it? Now, we're going to find later, it's not until a later chapter, that the name of manna is given to it. And we're going to find that the word manna means, what is that? But that was what they called, what they asked. What is it? They didn't know what it was. Not knowing what it was, they didn't know what they were supposed to do. And so Moses said to them, it is bread. And then he said, this is what the Lord has commanded. Each one is to gather as much as he needs. Take an omer for each person you have in the tent. Okay? You need to gather from this bread what you're going to eat for that day. You need an omer's worth for the day, for each person that's in your tent. Now, it's interesting, the word omer is defined in many different ways. There's several different quantities that an omer supposedly refers to. For example, some commentators say that it refers to a cupful. Other commentators say it refers to a gallon. And then there are commentators that are all in between. 1 quart, 2 quarts. We're not sure, but it was a measurement of the day. A measurement of the day. And he said, you should take 1 omer for each person that's in your tent. Now, we're then told that the Israelites did as instructed. Each one gathered as much as he needed. Then Moses gives them and there seems to be another miracle here, because it says the one that gathered a lot had just enough. And the one that gathered a little bit had just enough. It seems to be there's some expansion and contraction miracles going on here. But at the end of the time that they gathered the manna and they measured it with the omer, it seemed like each of them had just the right amount. That may have been a miracle too, in and of itself. Then we get down to verse 19. Moses said, no one of them is to keep anything until morning. And that leads to the next test. Of course, we're not going to get into that in this lesson. But the idea was they were given instructions and they obeyed. The emphasis here, regardless of whether it's more than an omer or less than an omer, the emphasis here is they had all they needed. Okay? They had their needs were supplied. God has a plan. Their needs were supplied. God said, I've heard your grumblings. Now you will know that I am Yahweh, promise-making, promise-keeping God. You're going to have meat to eat. Now you will see the glory of the Lord. You will have bread to eat from a supernatural source you've never seen before. God has a plan. He's opened the doors and worked this plan through these people, through Moses and Aaron. And now he is showing that he is the faithful God who keeps his promises. He's promised to deliver them to the promised land. They're not there yet. He's going to take care of them till they get there. He fights for his people, and he provides for his people, as we've seen here. This week, we're faced with circumstances. Oh, we're like the children of Israel. We can go back and point time and time and time again where God has done things in our lives. But the human side of us, human nature side of us is so, there's such a propensity to get your attention on the crisis and off of him. Get your attention to anticipate the starvation. I'm a little bit hungry. I'm going to starve. It'd be better if I would stay and eat. He says, God provides for his people. He is Yahweh, the promise-making, promise-keeping God. He is the faithful promise-keeping God. He's promised us that he would provide, and he does. Maybe not exactly as we would anticipate. I mean, let's face it, dew turning to bread on the ground is a little bit beyond our comprehension. Sometimes he provides in ways that we understand. The quail on the ground, we might understand. But God has a plan for us individually. And just like he did for them, he will provide. But we need to keep our focus on him. Not on the circumstances, not on the crisis, but on him. Confident that he is Yahweh, the promise-making, promise-keeping God. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the privilege of being called your children. We thank you for the privilege of having your word and seeing your faithfulness down through the centuries. We thank you for the privilege of having received your call in our lives, and to look back and see the way you have worked in our lives again and again. And so whatever we will be facing in these next few days, as of now, we commit ourselves to you and just simply pray that you would work in us and through us to accomplish your will. We realize you have a plan. We are confident that you will provide for us. And so we relax in the center of your will. For it's in the name of the one who called us, Jesus the Christ, that we pray. Amen.